badly run cities can actually be very dangerous for the health, political and otherwise, of its residents. But generally, cities provide the most efficient way of economic interaction, of political progress, of democratization for all of its residents, but more critically, I think, for the purposes of this discussion, access to employment, access to services, hard services like land, water, sewerage, energy, and critical services, education, health. They are reflections of the fact, really, that humanity is a social being, and it's in cities that we interact, produce, become more effective, and become more efficient. And ultimately is where we make most of our progress. Most growth that takes place in the absence of forward planning for cities. Sometimes urbanization and the growth of cities is seen as a problem because it's manifested in urban poverty, in slums, in bad conditions. The response to that is better planning and better service provision, although the response that we often see is an attempt to slow down or negate the possibility of urban growth. And so there's still, as there was in London in the 19th century, this hugely negative image seen around poverty in cities. The solution, like London, was to rethink the city. And so, as we've often said to mayors, if 30 or 40 or 50% of your population is living in slums, you don't have a slum problem, you have a city problem, and you need to rethink your cities. So I think the biggest obstacle to the solution would be proper planning and proper service provision, ideally in advance of population movement and population growth. Those are the two main sources of the growth of cities. We don't see that, with very few exceptions, in most cities. The net result is that most growth is informal, and it is on the worst possible land because it's not made available, and therefore the urban poor become the most exposed to disasters, man-made and others. Well, historically, maybe the most famous example of forward planning would have been Manhattan in 1811, when a grid system was laid out in advance of the population. That was 200 years ago, and as we know, not every city is going to turn into Manhattan, but the wisdom of the planners was certainly well rewarded. We see in those countries where there is clarity about the power of urbanization, it has been used as a driving economic force. The most obvious case over the last 3 decades would be China, where the cities on the eastern seaboard have been the source of the economic miracle, and the populations, largely rural populations or small city populations, moving into those cities. But maybe more appropriately would be to look at cities in a country like Ethiopia, the second most populous country in Africa, famous for the drought and the famine of 2 and 3 decades ago, is now, through its secondary cities, doing forward planning and is already anticipating what the population will be in some of the cities in the year 2040, and is working backwards to reserve land to provide those services so that it's in advance of the event rather than always catching up, because the default model that we have seen throughout Latin America and in most other countries in Africa is to plan after the event. And so the most expensive way of servicing our cities is the default model.